In this video, I will introduce you to the Global Yield Gap Atlas. It's a tool to identify production potentials and yield gaps around the world. Yield gap analysis is powerful to reveal how much agriculture production could increase on existing land if management practices were improved. This is highly relevant knowledge if we want to increase our world food production in a sustainable manner, thus without putting too much pressure on the environment, for instance through expansion of agricultural land. And that is a very relevant question now that the FAO is forecasting about 60% increase in demand for food by the year 2050. In a recent major project, we are developing the so-called Global Yield Gap Atlas. For all important food crops and production areas in the world, we aim to quantify potential and actual yields as accurately as possible for the local conditions and map the results in an online atlas. We always work with local experts to use the best data and to evaluate the results before publishing them. Here is an example for Northwest Europe for winter wheat under rain-fed conditions, so no irrigation. The green colors indicate a relatively small yield gap. The difference between the water-limited potential yield and the average farmer's yield is only about 20%. It's hardly possible to do any better under farmers' conditions. But suddenly, when we cross the border from Germany to Poland, the color becomes yellow, indicating a yield gap of about 50%. Now, the environment is not so hugely different between Germany and Poland. So it must point at management differences between these two countries, probably caused by a distinct difference in history and development of farming in both countries. In the atlas, we also calculate the water productivity. Here you see an example for rain-fed maize in Africa. We now go to the online tool, yieldgap.org. On the home page, you see a range of tabs of a portal and a link to the atlas. Let's first have a look at some key information that you can find on the portal. First, and very important, you can find here all information about the methods. You see site selection, actual yield information, weather data, crop management, etc. Second, when you click on yield gap by country, you will see a map with all countries with completed yield gap analysis so far. The table below it shows the crops per country for which you can find yield gap information in the atlas. Per subcontinent, you can click on the countries, for instance Burkina Faso, and per country you can find information on agriculture, on local partners, and details about how the method for yield gap analysis has been performed, including a facility to download the data that have been used and all results of the analysis. Further, this portal provides a glossary and access to publications related to the yield gap atlas. If we then go back to the home page, we can go to the atlas itself by clicking on the map. The first screen we get is a map of Africa. The dots on this map are the locations of the weather stations that have been used in the calculations. We can also visualize other geographical features like the administrative boundaries or the cities. And you can show different crop area masks. Let's take the mask for maize. And you can also show a climate zonation. And we can also combine the two. Let's take the climate zonation and rain-fed maize production areas. When clicking on the continent or the region of interest, in the left upper corner, we can select another continent or region. Let's take Europe. Let's now go to the yield gap maps. We click on Show Yield Gaps. You can select the crop of your choice, for instance rain-fed wheat, the aggregation level, for instance the climate zones, the indicator related to yield gaps, for instance the water limited yield or the absolute yield gap or the actual yield. Let's take the absolute yield gap. And the selected variable, which is mean value in this case, but there's also information for other indicators about the variation. Let's take rain-fed wheat production at climate zone level as an example and focus on the absolute yield gap. You can see that the yield gaps in the Netherlands and Germany are in the range of the light and the darker green colors, meaning a yield gap of less than 3 tons per hectare. In Poland, you can also see yellow colors, indicating a yield gap of around 5 tons or even more. Another feature I want to highlight is to dig for underlying information. For instance, when you click on a weather station in Germany, you will get the weather station of the climate zone we are in, and the harvested areas, the cropping intensities, and the yield gaps of those 3 weather stations. The value of the entire climate zone is then a weighted average of those 3 weather stations. Finally, it's possible to compare maps of different indicators. For instance, we compare the one we already had for rain-fed wheat at the climate zone level, and we now look at the actual yields. So we now have 2 maps next to each other, one with the absolute yield gaps and one map with the actual yields for rain-fed wheat production in Northwest Europe. With this, I hope to have given you sufficient introduction to use the website of the Atlas and to obtain insight in the yield gaps of important food crops across the globe. The Global Yield Gap Atlas is publicly accessible, and if you like to use the Atlas, please visit our website www.yieldgap.org.